Hello and welcome back to another big comparison of heatsinks for PS5. For those who aren't aware, if you are going to upgrade the storage on your PS5 system, then it's highly recommended, not just by me, not just by the internet, but by Sony themselves, that when installing an SSD inside this system, that you get yourself a heatsink. A heatsink is a little bit of metal that dissipates and sucks the heat off of the SSD that gets very hot in operation, and then dissipates it into the surrounding air. However, Sony themselves have not only not issued an official compatibility list for SSDs on this system months and months after the upgradable storage element is available, but on top of that, they don't really give much indication of heatsinks. Now, the majority of users, when this system first enabled the ability to upgrade their storage, went for heatsinks like this tiny one here. This is a $10 heatsink from a company called ElecGear. Now there's lots of them out there, but this is general, the theme. Again, about $10, a little bit more. And this surrounds the SSD. The SSD goes inside there. There's a little rubber plate or silicone even on either side, and it lives inside the slot of your PS5. Now, as good as that sounds, it's worth remembering that these were not designed for this. These were designed for PCs. PCs with giant open tower cases that have got fans running through all the way along, lots of open air and lots of space to dissipate the air of the heatsink there, and therefore get rid of all the heat from the SSD that they install inside their system. However, in the case of the PS5, the PS5's internal storage system, if you're not aware, if we remove that panel, is this slot right here. Now that slot right there is a M2 slot inside there that the SSD goes inside, but because the PS5 uses negative pressure, which is that it's drawing air in from the front, circulates it on that fan and then pushes it out the back when it's too warm and useless to use, in order to maintain the integrity of that system, the M2 there is covered. Now that M2 slot in there is not great for something like that. This is designed with active airflow in mind. That's why today's comparison exists. This comparison here, we are looking at 4 of the heat sinks for PS5, which pretty much everyone, myself included, are recommended. They're not the only 4. There's a couple of others out there, because I do think the ElecGear is still a great $10 SSD. It's just not designed completely with this in mind. There are other heat sinks out there that are a little bit crazy, like the massive overkill one that we've talked about on the channel before, the Eno heat pipe, which although very effective, is tremendous overkill. The 4 heatsinks right now that pretty much everyone utilises, or at least recommends, again myself included, are these. Now, these can fall into 2 categories. Category number 1 is heatsinks that arrive with the SSD you choose. So if you've been looking at a Seagate Firecuda or a WD Black SSD, chances are these are the heatsinks that you have either got or considering. The Firecuda 530 heatsink there that arrives pre-attached to the SSD inside there. We're going to be testing this, and we're going to be facing it off with another SSD that includes a heatsink. This, the WD Black, one of the most popular drives for PS5 upgrades, and indeed has a great little heatsink there on board. Now, the other half of the spectrum is people that don't want to buy a WD or a Seagate hard drive SSD, and therefore can't get access to those heatsinks. For those users, it's really been falling into these 2 categories. This is the Sabrent PS5 heatsink, and this is the ElecGear PS5 designed heatsink. Now these are designed for any SSD you want to use. Sabrent, obviously, they have their own range of SSDs as well, so you can get a combo with that one, but it doesn't limit you to only use their heatsink. Now, we're going to be doing lots of temperature tests. We're going to be running 6 separate tests on this PS5 system. We're going to install it inside. We're going to utilise our trusty temperature reader. We're going to make sure that all side plates are back on there. Again, if there are images within the video that show the SSD exposed in here, if it's an SSD like these 2 that can be installed inside there with that metal plate will be on, as well as the side plate on top there, that plate that we've just removed there. In the case of the ElecGear and the Sabrent, these are SSDs that do not need that little metal plate, so it won't be on top, although the outside plate there will be on. So before we go into our tests, let's take a little look at these individual SSD heatsinks. So there is the Seagate and the WD there. That is their heatsinks. Now, the Seagate Firecuda is a tremendously effective heatsink there. It is a solid mass of aluminium that's coated there all the way around. It's a metal surround heatsink all the way there. The SSD is inside, and the thermal padding has been placed inside as well. We've done full reviews and testing on this independently. It's a great little heatsink. It's going to be interesting to see how it performs against the others. The WD Black, formerly, I'll be completely upfront with you, my SSD heatsink of choice, but further testing has kind of started to indicate to me that one of the reasons this heatsink did so well in PC testing was because of that ventilation there on the side. This is an SSD that can run quite hot. It was one of the earliest 7,000 megs SSDs on the market, and therefore the efficiency and stuff that's been worked on in the last 12 months had happened after its initial release. There's been countless firmware updates for it, but it's still quite a hot running SSD there. And again, this heatsink is ventilated all the way through, which in PC is great with the air flowing through the system, but in a closed system like this, let's see how that pans out there, because again, I'm less convinced. It's a great SSD and a great heatsink, and if you do already have it, stick with it. It's a great one. But again, I'm just curious how it's going to weigh up against these, which are less optimized around the idea of active airflow within such a closed environment. Now, with regards to these two, the Sabrent and the ElecGear, I've already done independent temperature sensing videos and overall hardware reviews for these, but these are heat sinks that not only cover the SSD inside there, but fully occupy, let's turn those around, fully occupy the entire slot and replace there. Both of these filling the inside of that M2 slot and with the SSD inside. Both of them featuring metallic grooves all the way through that capture the air that's running through the system to cool the heatsink, and therefore as the heat that's being drawn from the SSD into these heat sinks is being soaked up, then the dissipation of that into the opening air is a great deal more effective, and the heatsink being cooled down because of those grooves being directly in the airflow of the PS5. Now, obviously there's the wonder of what does that do to the core temperature of the system, because now we're warming up the air a tiny bit as it goes into the central fan to cool the CPU, the GPU and the memory before it gets spat out the back. So during our testing, of course, we will be looking at not only the temperature of the SSD, but the temperature of the outside of that bay as well in a 2-node test there. The other thing worth bearing in mind there is, obviously in the case of the Seagate Firecuda and the WD Black, these are going to be utilising their own SSD. You can't buy these heatsinks independently. But in the case of these two heatsinks, we're going to be utilising the Team Group T-Force Cardia A440. The reason being, it's just a great middle point for in terms of price, value, and architecture. Quite similar in many ways to the Seagate Firecuda there. It's got a Firezone E18 controller, it's got a 96-layer 3D TLC NAND, it's got a decent level of durability, and it spits out 7,000 megs easy on the read, and even the write 5 to 6,000 there. So I thought this is perfect to test with these without any of the heat sinks or panels included, just the SSD. And while we're on that subject, for those that are going to point it out, do bear in mind that when we're testing the SSD temperature, we aren't looking at the whole SSD. We're only looking at the controller, the middle chip. In the case of this SSD, at least anyway, it does change location depending on the SSD, because the NAND, where your data lives, can afford to get a little warm. It actually works quite well when it's a bit warm. But the controller, the hotter the controller gets, the kind of worse it can perform. Most controllers on SSDs are designed to run quite well between about 30 to 50 C, so that's absolutely fine. But the minute it creeps out of 50 and closer towards 70 C, then the controller will start throttling itself or lowering the performance internally, because it doesn't want to degrade or kind of ruin the durability of itself and its architecture. So again, that's why heatsinks exist, to keep these devices running at an optimal temperature for a sustained use. Now, some of you may also have noticed, you certainly noticed in the other videos, that this heatsink here also features that copper pipe. Now, that copper pipe is designed to not only allow dissipation of heat onto the general heatsink, but it's far more conductive for heat from the SSD itself and the thermal pads. The result is that even early testing of this heatsink showed that it withdrew significantly more heat than most other heat sinks. However, its dissipation into the air is a totally different matter there. It is very conductive and it can offset that heat quite quickly, but remember, that thermal pipe is not visible or accessible in the general air outside of the normal heatsink, and is completely reliant on the aluminium top there to dissipate it into the air. It's not like the overkill one that we talked about before, the Eno heat pipe, where it has that copper pipe and it's in a contained environment, but it has kind of like an antenna structure that then fans that into the air. So yes, that is our setup. We're going to look at these four SSD heat sinks with their respective SSDs or the Cardia inside to see how they behave in two different gameplay environments and some heavy write, heavy read. Let's go straight into the tests, talk over the results, and then summarize at the end. Let's go. So as always, we're starting our test with Red Dead Redemption here in autopilot mode here over the course of around 25 minutes on all four of the SSD and heatsink combination tests we're running here. We've got one node based on top of the controller of the SSD, and again, that's regardless of whether it's the WD Black, Seagate, Sabrent or ElecGear, those last two obviously utilising a different SSD. That T-Force, and another node outside of the heatsink and the thermal padding area located just underneath the fan of the PS5. So as we're testing this here, we can see that all of them have started relatively close. The WD Black, certainly the higher of all of them in the ambient temperature there, and all of the others living somewhere between the 30 to the 33 mark early doors. Now, the first thing that strikes you immediately, much like previous comparisons and tests and kind of overviews of the ElecGear, is the ElecGear still comfortably runs at a lower controller temperature there. It definitely does one of the best jobs out there of maintaining the low temperature of the controller on the SSD. Of course, the controller is the thing that you want to keep at the lowest possible temperature. All of them are kind of only gradually growing there. We're not going to see a huge increase here. One of the things I did notice early doors, and definitely something when I did my comparisons between those PS5 designed heatsinks and those heatsinks for M2 SSDs inside PC environments, was that the WD Black and the Seagate certainly were the higher temp in almost every single test. Now, a lot of that, as mentioned previously, is to do with these heat sinks that the Seagate and the WD and traditional like $10, $15 heat sinks are out there are designed for PC installations, not PS5, which has a very different physical architecture with regards to airflow. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the game's testing. But with regards to this test during the Red Dead Redemption and focusing specifically on the node for the controller, it's pretty clear early doors that the WD and the Seagate there have a higher temperature both at the beginning and general increase throughout the course of the testing. Indeed, as this controller temperature test spun out, we saw that the WD Black ended up rising 3.3 degrees, which is still incredibly small throughout the testing. The Seagate raised 3.4, the Sabrent 2.1 degrees, and finally there at the end, the ElecGear, the smallest increase at 1.4 degrees. And again, that was the lowest starter as well. So all the way through this early test of the controller, the ElecGear ruled the waves. But of course, we don't just want to focus on that. We want to look at the ambient airflow. Now, the ambient airflow, while we're playing Red Dead Redemption, again, this is a second test. We closed out the game, gave it a minute and a half, and then rebooted the system. And in the case of this autopilot test, for the exact same length of time, we could see what was going on outside of the storage area. Now, the reason we're looking at this with a second node on the temperature measurement module there, an inch from the internal fan, is we want to make sure that the heat that's being dissipated out of the controller chip of the SSD and then into the heatsink to be freed into the air isn't negatively impacting the overall temperature in the PS5 system. It's not just about storage. We have to make sure that the ambient temperature outside of the storage area isn't negatively impacting the CPU, the GPU, and the memory and the general components of the PS5 and its negative pressure system. Now, in the case of this testing, all of these systems started at a near identical level. There was about a degree to a degree and a half between them, with the highest ambient temperature being the WD at 25.9 and the lowest ambient temperature, once again, using that ElecGear there because it didn't It kind of dissipated the air a great deal quicker than anyone else out there. But nevertheless, all the way through the testing, the increase across all 4 of these was very, very small across the rest of the storage system. Indeed, between all of them, the biggest increase we saw was that of that Seagate at 0.3 degrees, which is so minimal it almost bears zero relevance at all. Now, the rest of the system was, the temperatures by the end of this test session broke down as follows. The WD at 0.2 degrees, the Seagate we just mentioned at 0.3, the Sabrent at 0.2, and once again, the ElecGear really storming it here in this test at 0.1. It's still the most expensive heatsink here, but at least you are getting an understanding that you are getting something extra for that money. Again, the tests are by no means over yet, but right now, as far as Red Dead Redemption and the controller temperature and the ambient airflow throughout the system and the core temperature for the PS5 system have leaned a little bit more towards the ElecGear than anyone else. With those first-party heatsinks from WD and Seagate, which are originally designed, it has to be said, for PC systems, it has to be said, are ever so slightly behind, but we have to remain relative and know that these differences in temperature are so small there could be any number of environmental factors that could affect them. We're going to wrap things up on Red Dead Redemption 2 now and make our way over to another similar but large game in the form of GTA 5. Let's switch over now. Now, the testing on Grand Theft Auto, although very similar to that of Red Dead Redemption, is actually slightly different to what we saw in Red Dead Redemption. Now, in GTA, it is still open world. We're using the autopilot there with the taxi taking us through from the south of the city to the north in single player mode there. But there's lots more random instances and high assets that we see around while going through the world there. Although the games aren't tremendously similar, anyone that's ever looked at the data files and the size of these games and the PC loading will know that they're similar in architecture, at least as far as design goes, but once you break it down into the blibs and blobs of data, there's actually quite a lot to distinguish them. Now, in the case of this test, once again, we've returned to testing the controller temperature. We've got a node located underneath all 4 heatsinks and underneath all 4 heat pads directly on the controller component, which is located in a slightly different area on the Team Group SSD and the Seagate and the WD. Now, this was an unusual one. We rebooted the system after a complete power off for a minute and a half. We powered down the system and then cold booted back into this game, allowing the system approximately 2 to 2.5 minutes between game loads to let the general heat dissipation of that SSD be freed up into the air. Now, with all of them, they all started, with the exception of one, in the 30 or so degrees, with the lowest of those 3 being the Seagate at 34.3 degrees, and the WD and the Sabrent starting at 39 and 38 respectively. However, the ElecGear once again not only maintaining a much cooler controller temperature on the SSD, but also assisted dissipation thanks to the fans and the slits in the way of that internal cooling system, resulted in the ElecGear starting at an impressive 26.7 degrees. Now, bear that in mind, of course, there are environmental factors. These had to be recorded on different days because each test took around 6 to 7 hours. The result was that even if you factor in environmental temperatures, that's still a great start from the ElecGear on GTA. Now, as we move throughout the test, we could see that the increases were incredibly similar throughout, with the Seagate and the ElecGear both raising, the Sabrent and the ElecGear raising 1.4 degrees, the WD Black raising 1.8 degrees, but the out-and-out winner was the Seagate, raising just 0.1 degrees, starting at 34.3 and ending around 34.4. A great impression. Let's test ambient airflow. Now, testing the ambient airflow during GTA and the playback here in a completely new session, once again rebooted, we can see that between all of them, the one that started the hottest was that Sabrent. The Sabrent wasn't able to dissipate as much heat as it would have liked, and it started off at 29.3. Now, the rest of them started a few degrees lower, with the Seagate at 24 degrees on the nose, the WD at 25.6, But once again, the ElecGear managing to dissipate plenty of heat and going down to start this new test session at 21.8 degrees. Now, once again, ambient airflow being as important as it is to make sure it doesn't degrade on the rest of the PS5 system, I'm pleased to say that once again, all of these heat sinks did a bang up job of keeping things lovely and cool and making very small impacts on the ambient temperature. None of them really going in any way negative that would be, detrimental to the heat of the system. If I had to say which one raised the highest temperature, you'll be surprised to hear that the one that went the highest was the ElecGear, with the ElecGear raising just 1.1 degrees. Now, as much as that sounds bigger than the 0.9 of the Sabrent, the 0.6 of the Seagate, and the 0.5 of the WD, we have to also bear in mind that it started the lowest. The ElecGear went from 21.8 to just 22.9. Now, comparing it against the Sabrent at 29.3, which raised to 30.6, the Seagate raising from 24 to just 24.6, and the WD raising at the start at 25.6, ending at around 26.1, all of them did a bang-up job of the ambient temperature, and the ElecGear started low, and although it had the largest increase, was still lower than all of the others. Once again, with regards to ambient airflow, I think and I hope this test does indicate that these PS5 heatsinks are not negatively impacting the rest of the PS5 system. Indeed, the heatsinks that aren't designed around the SSD bay on the PS5 and cooling that take advantage of PC architecture heatsinks, in other words, the WD and the Seagate, they didn't make, any kind of negative impact, but there's still no avoiding that in all but one case, they did seemingly start off at a higher temp and only increased as time went on. I think a lot of the time these PS5 designed heatsinks are pretty much the way forward, I think, for a lot of the gameplay, when heat needs to be dissipated organically over a larger amount of time. The increases are always much, much smaller on these heatsinks. Let's try some heavy read activity. Now, with the heavy read activity, what we were doing was moving data from the M2 SSD that we've installed and onto the PS5 system. Between all of these, we're copying over around 350 gig of data. We're not looking at how long each one took, because between each of these tests, there was a couple of small updates to games that increased their size just incrementally. What we're looking at here is temperature increases. Now, as data is moving over, we can see that the increases on all of them, while data is being moved from the SSD that we've installed over to the PS5 SSD, that the increases aren't that big indeed. But once again, much like our PC testing of the WD Black SN850 that we've done before, we know that that SSD can run a little hot, and that was once again indicated here. With regards to the opening temperatures, once again, the ElecGear certainly had the lowest controller temperature early doors, starting at just 29 degrees, and then in ascending order, the next one up was the WD Black at 31.4, the Seagate at 33.1, and the Sabrent, which hadn't dissipated all the heat from the previous testing, started at 40.1, which seems like a lot, but then you have to factor in that the increases are what we're really looking at here. And as we went through this test, we can see that increase-wise between all of them, it was a very different story. Now, if we're looking at the original temperature, that's always going to be an important factor. But as these increased, the results were as follows. The largest increase was from that WD, resulting and ending at around 44 degrees. Next up was the Seagate, that ended things at a notable increase of 7.8 degrees of increase, ending at 40.9, which is still pretty impressive. And then finally, we had the likes of the Sabrent there ending at 45.1 with a 5 degrees increase, and the ElecGear at 5.6 degrees of increase once again. So again, lots of interesting results, and with read activity being something we're not really going to do that much, we're not going to pay too much heed to these, but still nonetheless, this was a time when the early temperatures were incredibly diverse. The next test was moving that same data back onto the M2 SSD. So that's copying data from the internal PS5 SSD back onto the M2 SSD that we're using, whether it's the WD, the Seagate, or that Team Force Cardia that we've installed with the Sabrent or the ElecGear. Once again, the general system temperature, the general controller temperature that we're only looking at in these tests, we could see that once again, the Sabrent was the one that started the highest at 39.2. Again, this being the general temperature, I think, of that day affecting slightly there. It's still a great SSD heatsink, something I'll talk about more in the conclusion, but that was also the SSD that had the smallest increase as well, something that will be played out during the course of this write operation. Unsurprisingly, the one that started with the lowest core temperature early doors was of course the ElecGear, starting at 24 degrees once again, with the Seagate starting at 27 and the WD starting at 33.4. Once again, the write operation is where we really want to see how these SSDs perform, because this is going to be quite an extensive operation being performed here. Now, with regards to how they've all increased, with the exception of one, all of these heatsinks increased more than 10 degrees, but the biggest exception being the WD there that really did increase more than any other. Heavy write operations aren't really going to be that common when you're using the PS5. Maybe when you're downloading games and it's going to be very incremental based on your internet speeds, or when you're migrating games around. But still, write activity is important because this can be the most detrimental thing you can do to an SSD. And bear in mind, once again, we're only looking at the controller during the course of these particular tests. Overall, these results are already beginning to indicate just how clear the ElecGear keeps temperatures nice and low. It is a much more expensive heatsink, that's unavoidable, but one can't argue that you're getting, a little bit extra for your money, but really, are you going to need that? And that's kind of the big takeaway that I have about looking at all of these heatsinks. The PS5 heatsinks there, as we draw the test to a close, clearly do have the advantage in terms of overall cooling of that controller on the SSD, but now, as all of the results now complete, we can take a good long look of what we've seen here. Now, throughout all of the heavy write testing that we saw, of all of them, the heaviest increase between all of them, unsurprisingly, is that WD. The WD, throughout the course of its testing, went up a complete 17 degrees during that heavy write operation. Now, in of itself, that's still pretty good. That's not a bad increase for that amount of data being written very, very quickly in a sustained hit. And obviously, the dissipation afterwards was very, very quick too, but it was still notably higher than every other heatsink that we saw here. So, for example, the Seagate there increased 12 degrees. The Sabrent increased just 1.6 degrees, but it did start the highest overall, and the ElecGear increased 12.1 degrees. So of all of them, the Sabrent was the one that increased the least, but we also, of course, have to factor in that it started at the heaviest temp, and it was the one that dissipated the heat earliest doors the least. So let's resolve and talk about the results. So those were our tests, and let's look at what we saw. Let's be completely frank about it. Whether you look at all the individual results or all the scores as a whole, I think you'd be hard pressed to disagree that in terms of dissipation of heat and the lowest temperature overall test against test, the one that did the most heat dissipation was clearly the ElecGear there, with its incredible ability to dissipate the heat very, very quickly. It was by far the best heatsink in terms of cooling the SSD in your system, and therefore better performance long term. However, it's worth remembering, of course, that it's not just about the SSD's temperature. You've got to think about the rest of the system temp. And in that regard, it has to be said that the Sabrent was the better on balance for maintaining not only the SSD's temperature to an incredibly similar degree to the ElecGear, but also in terms of the rest of the system temperature being still greatly improved upon and not affected too negatively in the overall running of the system. Now, of course, these two heatsinks are ones that are designed for if you buy an NVMe without an additional heatsink already included. What about the number of you that are either already purchased or on the verge of purchasing the Firecuda 530 or the WD Black SN850? Two questions. One, should you buy their SSD heatsinks? And two, which one should you go for? Well, first question there, I'd say if you're going to buy the WD Black or the Firecuda 530, go with their heatsinks. I know they cost a little bit more, and certainly the way things have gone with regards to availability and pricing since this system included the ability to upgrade to these, the price of the heatsink version of these have risen from originally around $30 to about $40 to $50. But given that they are applied at the factory level and that they are applied in a dust-free environment with all of the thermal paste and thermal padding directly onto the right chips, I'd still recommend their controllers there, and they do a very good job of dissipating heat. Maybe not quite as well SSD focused only as these two here, but still exceptionally well in this system right here, which leads us to the other question of these two, which would you buy? And based on temperature alone, certainly the Firecuda was the one that dissipated the most heat. Even in our original PC testing, when we looked at these two drives on their own, we noticed that the WD Black didn't dissipate heat quite as well as the Firecuda. But do remember, nearly a year release difference between them, you would hope to see improvements like that between the two of them. But when it comes to all four of them here on the table, if you're going to buy, once again, a Seagate or WD drive, go for their own heat sinks if you can get them at a good price. However, if you're going to go for any brand of SSD out there, certainly between the two of them, I still probably vouch the most for that Sabrent there. It's a great little price at about $20, which is nearly half that of the ElecGear, with a great deal more availability, and the ElecGear being a lot harder to find around the internet globally, not just on your Amazons either. So regardless of which one of these four that you go for, you're going to end up with a nice, cool, operational PlayStation. So don't worry if you've already bought one and now you're starting to have buyer's remorse. Don't worry, they're all really good. But if you're on the verge of buying, you're on the cusp of choosing between them, then certainly go first party if you can. And if you don't need to go first party, certainly that Sabrent is still the king of the hill for me. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, chuck like. It genuinely helps the channel and helps me understand what you guys like about these videos, and then I make each video better than the last. If you want to learn more or stay equipped for the rest of these videos as we talk more and more about storage capabilities, network attached storage, direct attached storage, and of course storage upgrades for your gaming systems, then click subscribe and the bell to be notified, and do take advantage of the free advice section over on NAS Compares, linked in the description, made by two humans, me and Eddie the web guy. We answer every question that we can, and we answer it unbiased. We don't charge you, we don't do anything with your email. There's donate buttons, use them, ignore them, it's up to you. It might take us an extra day or so to answer your inquiry because we're two humans with lives, but we answer as much as we can. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.